Hello, my name is Dan Gibson, and this is another video in the series Archaeology in Islam. In this video, we are going to investigate Umayyad Qasrs, or large manor houses, to see if they were influenced by the Qibla direction. While writing the book Early Islamic Qiblas, it became increasingly evident that the original Qiblas of the Umayyad mosques either faced to the city of Petra in Jordan, or a spot halfway between Petra and Mecca in Saudi Arabia, or to Mecca itself. With this in mind, I investigated an additional 23 Umayyad structures. Now, these were not mosques. These are Umayyad structures to see if they had similar Qibla directions. Muslim armies entered Jordan in 629, and they met a large Byzantine force at the Battle of Muta in southern Jordan, and about 100 kilometers north of Petra. 7 years later, at the Battle of Yarmouk, they took control of Palestine, Jordan, and Syria, and they ruled this area until the Abbasids assumed control. In total, the Umayyads controlled this area for about 120 years. During this time, extensive building projects took place, some of them surviving in some form until this day. As these buildings generally fell into ruin after the Abbasid takeover, their foundations remain, and we can examine many of the original structures without later buildings interfering on the same site. However, in a few rare cases, some new structures were built on top. In order to prepare a list of Umayyad structures, I used data from my previous Qibla research, plus a number of buildings that were listed in the paper, Improvement of Mediterranean Territorial Cohesion Through the Setup of Tourist Cultural Itinerary Umayyad, by Naif Haddad, and contributions coming from Bilal Khirstat, prepared by the Caltech team back in 2014 and 15. In many cases, the buildings were visited by myself or one of my associates. I also used some satellite imagery, first to confirm the measurements made on the ground, and second, to make observations of the buildings that I had not visited, and finally, I used satellite photos for the purpose of illustration. With each of these structures, I tried to identify the Qibla direction of the structure and compare it with the four Qiblas, Petra, Mecca, Between, and Jerusalem. Note that the Qibla database, which is known as the online Qibla tool, also compares these Qiblas with the summer and the winter solstice, if that interests you. When I included these Umayyad buildings in the Qibla database, I experienced some resistance from a handful of Muslims who objected to Qibla data being included from structures that were not clearly mosques with a mihrab niche. In this short video, and in the accompanying paper, I will try and explain why these structures were included and what we can learn from them. Now, let's deal with the invention of the mihrab niche. After Ibn al-Zubayr's rebellion and the death of Caliph Abdul al-Malik in 86 after the Hijrah, al-Walid became the Umayyad Caliph. New mosques were constructed in Sana'a in Yemen, in Khirbat al-Minya in the Jordan Valley, and Hajjaj bin Yusuf began to build his Between Mosque in Wasat in Iraq. In 88 after the Hijrah, the Mosque of the Prophet in Medina was torn down and rebuilt, and the Qibla wall was changed in the rebuilding. It was during this rebuilding that the mihrab mark, or the niche, was introduced and then began appearing in new mosques and was added to old mosques. It should be noted that up until this time there was no question as to which direction the faithful should pray. Entire buildings faced the Qibla, with one wall designated as the Qibla wall. Now, however, the mihrab niche was added to old buildings and mosques, as well as used in new mosques in their construction, to clearly indicate which of the four Qiblas was indicated at that location. Now, here's a quote from the Encyclopedia of Islam. The first concave mihrab. that is Mihrab Mujawafa, was introduced by Umar bin Abdul al-Aziz, governor of Medina, when he rebuilt the Prophet's mosque between 87 and 88 after the Hijrah. It was richly decorated with precious materials. After that, the semicircular mihrab were spread throughout the Muslim world. Such a mihrab was introduced into the Great or Umayyad Mosque in Damascus when Al-Walid I took over the entire building and rebuilt it between 87 and 97 after the Hijrah. According to early accounts, it was set with jewels and precious stones. This mihrab was destroyed in 475 and was then subsequently rebuilt, but destroyed again in 1893. The third concave mihrab was built in the mosque at Amr al-Fustat in 92 after the Hijrah. Semicircular mihrab were flanked by pairs of columns, and these are found in many of the Umayyad desert palaces. The earliest surviving concave mihrab in a mosque is, according to Cresswell, in the mosque of Umar at Basra, built during the Umayyad period. The above was taken from the Encyclopedia of Islam, that's 2, and that was from volume 7. It was an article by Fairvari. According to the Dictionary of Islamic Architecture, the first concave mihrab niche was introduced in Medina between 704 and 709. Before this, and that's for 89 years, mosques did not have a distinct niche in a wall that indicated which direction the faithful should pray. Rather, early mosques simply had a Qibla wall that the faithful faced during prayer. Most buildings were not perfectly square, so while the entire building roughly faced the Qibla direction, one wall was specifically considered the Qibla wall. Now we can see this in Humayma, where the Qasr there, the side walls and the south walls have different orientations and angles, but the north wall is clear and clean and simple, and it faces towards the Kaaba in the city of Petra, some 27 miles away. In this Qasr, the Qibla faces north, and there is a long, wide prayer room that is immediately accessible for everyone via the hallway from the center courtyard. Now that's important. The mosque needed to be accessible by everyone and by visitors who came in. According to the information that I collected and displayed in the Qibla tool, over 20 mosques or Qasrs were constructed in the years before the mihrab was introduced. What is of prime importance to us is that most Muslims, even some historians, will only consider a location a place of prayer if they find a mihrab niche. This unfortunately does not allow them to identify any buildings as mosques or places of prayer prior to 109 AD, or after the first almost 100 years of Islamic history. Now let's talk about the development of the Qasr. The Qasr was a unique building, much more reminiscent of a large commune or of the reminiscent of the early Nabatean manor houses. These buildings did not suddenly appear at the beginning of Islamic history. Rather, these buildings have a long history of use among the Nabatean people who built the city of Petra. Incidentally, to my knowledge, no Umayyad Qasrs are found in Saudi Arabia. They are mostly found between Petra and Damascus. So let's consider the Nabatean manor house, or the villas, that preceded the Umayyad Qasrs. The first thing to notice is that these houses were large. There are some surviving Nabatean manor houses in the Nabatean city of Memphis in the Negev. A small private dwelling in Memphis covered about 700 square meters, or 7,500 square feet per house. The largest was over 2,000 square meters, or that's over 21,000 square feet in one house. There is also a building in Memphis that the archaeologists called a palace. The archaeologists who discovered the thought it was big and impressive, so they called it a palace, but there's no indication it really was a palace. It simply is a large house. The archaeologists were impressed by its size, and so it seemed like a palace to them. It occupied an area of 1,000 square meters, or about 10,000 square feet, and it also had a massive watchtower. All of these houses were 2 and sometimes 3 stories high, which added to the usable living space. From their construction, it seems that each of these houses was made to accommodate one extended family. Of course, wealth had a lot to do with the construction of these large buildings, and their huge size is unique to all of Palestine. These manor houses, or villas or mansions, had excellent quality masonry and sometimes extensive architectural decoration. In Memphis, both the palace and the private dwellings were built as self-contained fortresses with rooms around a central courtyard. Each unit had only one entrance, and the outside walls were solid with narrow slits high up on the walls. All these houses had at least 2 stories, and those above ground were reached by means of towers where there were stairs built around a heavy pier. The balcony that went around the top often surrounded the inner court. There were also storerooms and stables on the ground floor. The roofing system was based on arches and cover stones over the roof, but the courtyard in the center was open. There was at least one cistern for each house. Now, the public reservoir was large, about 18 by 10 meters. It was roofed over by arches resting on piers. Water storage consisted of a series of dams and collection places where floodwaters were transferred to private and public reservoirs in town. Now, here are some photos from a clip from a drone flying over the city. The large building at the bottom of this scene is a caravansary, or sort of inn for passing caravans to spend the night. Now, below I have a chart that compares the size of early Nabatean villa houses. Note that all the measurements are approximate, within a foot or two of accuracy. The Memphis house and the Petra manor were built several centuries before the Umayyad Qasrs, yet there are striking similarities between the Nabatean houses and the Qasrs. Now, number 1, the Nabatean Memphis house is 128 by 128 feet. That's 15,000 square feet. Now, north of the city was the Caravan Inn. It was 80 by 170 feet, so it was 13,000 square feet. And the Petra Manor House, it was excavated in Petra, was 104 by 116 feet, so that's 12,000 square feet. So these buildings were over 100 by 100 feet, making them all over 10,000 square feet. Now, the house I live in here in Canada is only about 1,000 square feet. So my house is 1/10 of the size of those houses. Now, let's look at the Umayyad buildings built several hundred years later. The Humayma house was 200 feet by 160 feet. That's 32,000 square feet. Over in Umayyad, the eastern Qasr was 230 by 228 feet. Now, that's 52,000 square feet. And the western Qasr was a little smaller, and it was 23,000 square feet. Qasr Kastal, as an example, it was over 50,000 square feet. That means my house is 1/50th of the square footage of that house. So I could fit 50 of my houses into one Qasr. Notice that the Qasrs all retained the same shape as the early Nabatean mansions. They all had one entrance, which led to an inner court. They had functioning rooms on the lower ground floor, living accommodations on the second floor. The Umayyad Qasrs were all built by powerful families who had considerable influence. The big difference between the Umayyad Qasrs is that they were not agreed on the Qibla direction. They all faced one of 3 different ones: Petra, Mecca, or the between position. Now, let's look at Qasrs in a bit more detail. As I said earlier, qasrs were built in a large square shape with an open central courtyard. Usually there was one primary entrance flanked by guard rooms, and this entrance opened into the central courtyard. All around were rooms that opened onto the courtyard, and there were very few windows that faced outward. All of this gave the qasrs an appearance of a military structure, and indeed these structures were often built at the intersection of local trade routes. Sometimes qasrs were built within view of each other to provide a line of structures that could signal and support one another. Now, a few of the qasr locations began as Roman buildings, and then some of them were converted into Byzantine monasteries, and later they were totally rebuilt as Umayyad qasrs. Each of these transitions was usually accompanied by builders tearing down the previous structure, setting an entirely new foundation, and then using the older building materials in the new structures. You see, earlier sites were chosen because of access to water, and also because this location had proven to be strategic, and especially because there was ready-made cut building stones at the location. Many qasrs had external gardens and orchards and agricultural land around the qasr. Some qasrs had additional bathhouses for the wealthy, and there were smaller residential buildings, usually away from the qasr, where the agricultural workers used to live, and it appears that these agricultural workers did not live or function in the qasr. They were restricted to areas outside of the qasr. We can see this at Qasr al-Hayr al-Gharbi, and we can see this at Humayma as well. In the case of Humayma, the archaeologists excavating the site were aware of Islamic accounts that tell us that the qasr was the home of the famous Abbas family. However, when they excavated the Humayma manor house, they did not find a mihrab niche. Unaware of the Petra location, or the option of Petric Qibla, they began to look farther and farther afield for a mosque, what they identified as a mosque. Initially, they had disregarded a series of small buildings to the east of the qasr because it was obvious to them that these buildings were the homes of the agricultural workers who worked in the fields and the orchards, and those orchards were watered by a nearby wadi, and so the houses were close to that wadi. However, on the last day of their dig, the archaeologists examined the small outer buildings and discovered a small room in this complex that had a mihrab niche. But there were problems. The mihrab could only be noticed by a single layer of stones placed on the ground. The rest of the building was missing. Probably later Bedouin had stolen the stones and used them in their own construction. If you look at a satellite photo, you can see multiple walls indicating various stages of residential development at that area over the years. Now, I visited this qasr several times over the years that the archaeologists were excavating. It was one of the closer excavations to where we lived at that time, and during those visits I noticed that the small mosque had different mihrabs at different times. Did you catch that? Different mihrabs at different times. It seemed to me that they couldn't decide how to place the mihrab stones. Of course, once some well-meaning Arab had realigned the stones to a better position, the original settings of the stones was lost. And I've searched my photos for a picture of the various mihrabs, but unfortunately none have survived from those visits. Now let's talk about qasr life for a moment. Life in the qasr was focused onto the central courtyard. This yard was the main way of connecting when moving from parts of the qasr from one place to another. Basically, you went outside through the courtyard and then into another part of the building. Many of the qasrs also had a second story and with a balcony around the central courtyard so people could go outside, around, and into another room. Some of these had access to the roof so the building could be defended even from the roof on top. These central courtyards were places where people gathered Animals were handled, grain and fruit supplies were brought in and put into storage places. Large cooking events took place there. The courtyard was a place where the faithful could gather to pray, or it had immediate access to the prayer room. A mosque or a prayer room in the Qasr had a door into the central courtyard. You didn't go through private living quarters to get to it. Now let's talk about prayer places located inside the Qasr. It appears that the very first Qasrs had no additional mosque outside of the structure. We can see this from Khirbat al-Minya and al-Kharana and other early Qasrs. Since the mihrab niche had not yet been invented, there was no marking on any walls to indicate that there was a special place of prayer. Instead, it appears that the open central courtyard, which was common to everyone, was used as a place of prayer, or that a special room was used that was immediately behind the large flat wall, which was deemed the Qibla wall. Now here we can see a drawing of Qasr al-Khair al-Gharbi. The Qasr is oriented towards the between position. The archaeologists discovered a very small room down in the lower corner here with a mihrab. Because this was the only room with a mihrab, they labeled this one room as a mosque. However, this room was not accessible from the main courtyard, and it was probably only used for women or was a personal place of prayer. It was very small in a corner. The mihrab could have been added later. The most obvious place for prayer was the one in the center of the southern wall, accessible to the main courtyard, with doors leading to the right and to the left. Any of the other rooms, or even the south end of the courtyard, could have been used for a place of prayer, as the entire building was constructed so the rooms were aligned to the between Qibla position. Now let's talk about the change of the Qibla. As we've already mentioned, the mihrab niche was developed around 89 after the Hijrah, right about the time that there were 3 different Qiblas in use in the Muslim world. With these changes, old mosques needed to be changed. Also, Qasrs needed to be changed as well, especially if the leading family had now agreed to change their direction of prayer, in keeping with whatever the Caliph had said in Damascus. We see this in the town of Al-Walid. Here there are 2 Qasrs. It seems that there were 2 families, or maybe there was one family that didn't agree and they ended up splitting into 2. We don't know for sure. Now, the original eastern Qasr was built facing the city of Petra, like all the other early Qasrs. The other family, or split from the main family, they built themselves a newer Qasr not too far away. That Qasr is known today as the Western Qasr, but it does not face Petra. Rather, its orientation is towards the between position. Well, a short time later, the Mecca Qibla became the most popular. So the family in the Eastern Qibla, in the Eastern Qasr, built an external mosque for those who wanted to pray towards Mecca. So here in one town, we have evidence of all 3 Qiblas distinctly demonstrated in the architecture of that town. Some Qasrs, however, chose not to build an external mosque. Once the new Qibla was developed, and they then tried to modify the Qasr. We can see this at Khirbat al-Mafjar. The original Qasr's interior courtyard, that is the northern part of the Qasr, faced south towards Petra. But later, a specific room in the southern part of the Qasr was chosen for a mosque, and a hole was knocked into the wall to incorporate a mihrab niche. But the break in the wall severely weakened the structure, so that the structure had to significantly reinforce the wall, and so the builders came and built this big reinforcement. Now here we can see an attempt to turn the Qibla towards the between Qibla. Now, there are Umayyad structures that are not constructed as mosques, but are included in the Qibla database. I've developed a list of these qasrs or other buildings that I feel demonstrate that these buildings were constructed with a Qibla direction in mind, and that Qibla was incorporated into the orientation of the structure. On the website, I deal with each structure individually. When using the Qibla tool, just check the link More Info to access further information. Now, this table lists these qasrs in chronological order, and we can see that there are 10 qasrs with no accompanying mosque, and in each of these cases the structure itself is oriented towards the Qibla, as indeed are 17 of the 21 structures. Here are the qasrs, their GPS coordinates, their orientation of the qasr itself, and the orientation of any later mosques. The earliest is the qasr in Humayma, followed by Khirbat al-Minya, then al-Kharana, and then al-Walid eastern qasr, and then al-Walid the western qasr, then Khan al-Zabib, and then Anjar, then Khirbat al-Mafjar, then Qasr al-Kastal, then Muwakkar, and then Hayar al-Gharbi and Hayar al-Sharqi, the Aman Palace, Bayr Qasr, Mushta, and then the unfinished Tuba, and Ukhayder, and then Fudyan, and then the smaller Ain al-Sil, and then Askin, and then Mushash, and finally the unexcavated Qasr Halbat. So, in this video, I have introduced you to more than 20 Umayyad qasrs. They are all located between Petra and Damascus. When considering all of these qasrs together, we can trace certain patterns: the large size, the central courtyard, the single gate, the lower floor being the working area, the upper floor being the homes of the extended family. The first qasrs did not have separate mosques. Many never did have a mosque like we might identify it. Some of these qasrs developed internal prayer areas, but in 9 instances an external mosque was built at a later date, sometimes with a different, more modern qibla than the original qasr. The original qasrs were oriented so they had a qibla wall facing Petra. Sometime later, Umayyad qasrs were constructed with a qibla wall facing the between position, and finally 4 of these qasrs had a Meccan qibla. In every case, the qasrs were oriented towards one of these 3 qiblas. I'm Dan Gibson, and this has been another video in the series Archaeology and Islam.